This lens makes images that are just gorgeous, and it proves that you don't need a more expensive, faster, more complex lens to make really great images. This lens will do it for you. Well, hey everybody, thank you for checking in and welcome to another one. There are a lot of fast vintage lenses with apertures of f1.4, f1.2, f1, even an f0.95 vintage lens. But the faster the aperture of a lens, the heavier, the larger, and the more expensive they become. And we don't need a very fast lens in order to make a really nice shot with a vintage lens. I've got 5 lenses to show you today with maximum apertures of f2, and I reckon that strikes the perfect balance between size, weight, expense, and the ability to create some nice blur in the background. So I'm going to show you these 5 lenses today in the hope that I can prove to you that f2 really is all you need. So here's the first lens that I would like to show you today, and this is an interesting f2 lens. This is not a 50mm. Many f2 lenses are 50mm, but this one is not. This one is a 28mm. This is the Vivitar 28mm f2, and this is interesting because it's actually quite a cheap wide-angle 28mm lens with an f2 aperture. There aren't actually many of these about. Many 28mm lenses you will see are f3.5 and many others are f2.8, but there aren't many at f2, and the ones that there are tend to be quite expensive. This one was not expensive. I bought this in Southend-on-Sea about a year ago or thereabouts, and it cost me all of £15, and I thought it was just a standard 28mm f2.8, but when I got it home I realised it was an f2, and that was really nice because I haven't had an f2 28mm lens before. This lens is quite a remarkable lens for other reasons too, one of the main ones being that it can go really close. Its closest focusing distance is 0.3 of a metre, 30 centimetres, which is about the length of a ruler, about that far. So this is a lens that can go very close to the subject, and it can make some really nice blur at those close distances as well, and that's quite unusual for a 28mm lens because of course the wider your lens, the less inherent ability it has to make blur. Well, now adding that f2 aperture and bringing the minimum focus distance down to a very short distance of 30 centimetres, that means this lens can make some blur at close distances. It doesn't make too much blur at longer distances, but certainly at close distances, 30 centimetres to about 60 centimetres, maybe a little further, you will get some blur from images made with this lens. It is a little bit soft at f2, but it sharpens up nicely when you stop it down to f2.8, and it's a really nice little lens. So there is our little Vivitar f2 28mm, and it's a beautiful little lens. It feels very nice to handle. Everything turns nice and cleanly and smoothly. The focus ring is at the front here, the aperture ring is at the back, and that turns nicely. It's slightly clunky, but it turns nicely enough, and there are no mechanical problems. No half stops on this lens, I don't think anyway. Oh no, there are half stops on this lens. What am I talking about? There are half stops on this lens, so you can change your aperture and select a value between the two nicely and easily. You're not just stuck to those values, so that's a really good thing. There's the nice big front element, and it is quite a nice big front element with lovely greeny bluey sort of purpley coatings on there, There is the rear. This one's in K-mount. Many of these Vivitar lenses were made in K-mount because K-mount was a really popular mount. Lots and lots of manufacturers used it and lots of cameras used it too. So that's a very nice little optic indeed. Colours from this lens are nicely saturated, just the way I like them. I don't like colours too pale personally. I like them just a little bit bumped up. I think if you're going to have colours, you may as well have saturated colours, but that's just a personal preference. Anyhow, if you like saturated colours too, this lens will make them for you. Very good contrast. It will wash out, like any lens, it will wash out in the sunlight. You will lose contrast, so use a hood if you're working in very strong light. This one has a fairly prominent front element as well. It doesn't have really very much of a recess, so it's nice and easy, very easy for light to strike that at the wrong angle. So yeah, use a hood with this one, but generally good contrast in good lighting conditions. Blur is very nice from this lens. It's a little untidy sometimes, occasionally at maximum aperture, but it tightens up if you stop down and if you change the ratio of distances between camera, subject and background. So slightly untidy from time to time, but nothing dreadful. So nice blur, good colour, a nice cheap lens that's very nicely made with a nice f2 aperture and a really interesting and useful ability to get very close to the subject. This is a very nice little optic from Vivitar, and it won't break the bank either. I paid £15 for this lens. As I say, that was probably lucky. I probably underpaid according to the market value. So if you buy one of these off eBay, it will more likely cost you between, I don't know, £50 to £70, something like that. But that's still a really good price for a 28mm f2 with a good close focus capability. A very nice little optic. There's plenty of them around, and you'll probably find one cheaper with patience and persistence. Okay, next is a very nice f2 lens that I've recently discovered and been getting to know. This is a lovely lens. It's the Nikon Nikkor 50mm f2, and as I say, this is a lens I've discovered recently and I've been shooting recently, and it did feature on an episode a short while ago, but it's such a nice lens. I think I'm going to remind viewers who saw it of how nice it is, and if you didn't see it, then yeah, this is a really nice 50mm f2. Being a Nikon lens, it's a little more expensive than some 50mm f2s. This usually sells on eBay for around about £70. I think I paid £70 for it. There are versions of this lens for sale for up to £90, even £100, but I wouldn't pay that. Pay between £50 to £70 for this one. That seems to be about the right value for now, as the market is now. This is a beautiful optic, and it's very nicely made in the Nikon tradition. It's all metal. I don't think there's any plastic on it anywhere. It's all nice and cold, so that suggests that it's metal. Very beautifully made, and it gives very beautiful images too. Here is a closer view of our Nikon, and you can see it's not a large lens. Obviously, if you're using this on mirrorless, you'll have an adapter which will add, I don't know, about a third as much again to the length, maybe half as much again. But it's not huge on a mirrorless camera, and that is one good thing about these f2 lenses, is that they don't tend to be too large in size, and that's a really good thing. I'm all for keeping photography gear small and light, and this one certainly achieves that. There's the front element with the lovely Nikon coatings. They work some proper magic on this lens, as I'll show you when we come to look at some images. Isn't that lovely? See the light reflecting off there? Very beautiful. There's the rear element, which also is coated. This is a multi-coated version. I believe this lens was made for several years and gradually improved and improved and improved. This is possibly the final version, or certainly near to the final version. Closest focus distance is 45 centimeters, which is about standard for an SLR 50mm f2 up to infinity, and f2 to f16 on the aperture dial there. Have we got half stops? No half stops on this lens, single stops only. A term with a nice clean click, and I do like these colours that Nikon used for the different numbers. Very nice little lens, not too big, not too heavy, and optically very, very nice indeed. And this lens does have, you'll see it does have a little bit of shelter from the sunlight. That front that front element is quite deeply dished, and so it does have some measure of protection from the sunlight, just as it is without using a hood, although obviously a hood will give you better protection. This lens makes very beautiful images, and it has a colour signature that's all its own. I've noticed that with several Nikon lenses. There doesn't appear to be a house style across the years or across the lenses, but many of them do have a very singular colour signature. One of those being the 50mm f1.4, which I've talked about in the past, and this little 50f2 has its own colour signature, which is nicer than the 1.4. This gives colours that are full of energy, full of brightness, full of light, full of joy, and it's just magical what it does with colours. They're very light, they're very upbeat, they seem to be somehow celebratory, somehow joyful, somehow just lovely colours that make the world seem a really good and happy place, which I'm sure it is. But looking through this lens, you would never doubt it for a second. It just makes beautiful, lovely, fantastic colours that just shine with joy, just beam with upbeat optimism. They're that nice. I really love the colours. This is one of my favourite lenses for colour, bar none. It makes some really nice background blur as well. Blur is lovely from this lens. It can be a little bit untidy here and there, as is the way with vintage lenses, but that's what gives them their character. It's those slight flaws in their design that gives them that slightly rough edge sometimes in the background blur. That's what gives these lenses character, that's what makes them individual, that's what gives them identity, and this lens has plenty of that. Blur is usually nice, it can be very, very soft, very beautiful, very lovely and very uniform, but at times it does have a slight roughness, and it just really demonstrates its character and its personality and its individuality, not just through its colour but through its background blur as well. This is a really, you could probably pick out an image shot by this lens from a lineup of images shot by other lenses. That's how different it is, and I guarantee it would be one of the nicest images in that lineup. This lens makes images that are just gorgeous, and it proves that you don't need a more expensive, faster, more complex lens to make really great images. This lens will do it for you. Here's an f2 lens that isn't an f2 lens at all. This is in fact an f1.8 lens, but that's as near as makes no odds. So we'll allow this lens in as a member of the f2 club. So this is, as you can see, a very small, very thin lens. It's not large at all. It's pretty much a pancake. This is, you might know already, the Konica Hexanon AR 40mm f1.8. This humble little optic is one of the nicest lenses I've ever shot, bar none. This is an absolute beauty. It's the nicest 40mm I've ever shot, bar none, and that includes modern vintage or any others, because it has such fantastic colour and optical characteristics and some very nice blur as well. Before we get into that, let's have a closer look at this beautiful little optic. And there's our little Konica. Look at it, isn't it? A beautiful little thing. 40mm f1.8. That's quite fast for a 40mm. In fact, most of them I've seen from other vintage lens manufacturers, most of them only go up to f2.8, so this is quite a fast 40. There are not many 40s from the vintage manufacturers. I know Pentax did one. I think Olympus did one also, but this is a really nice one, and I can't think that you'd find a lens at this focal length that will make images any nicer than this. The aperture ring is at the back, like with all the Konicas. Focus ring at the front, closest focus distance 45 centimeters. So it's a very small, light, wonderful lens. It's very nicely made. It's got the Hexanon 6-blade aperture, which we would expect to find with on a lens with the word hex, or the prefix hex in its name, meaning 6. And this is a very nice little optic indeed. Konica lenses are noted, were always noted for the very nice colours that they gave. This one is no exception. Not only is it no exception, but this Konica lens gives the nicest colours out of any Konica lens I've shot. That includes both the 50mm and the 57mm f1.4s. It includes the 50mm f1.7. It includes the 135mm lenses. This is the nicest Konica lens for colour that I've ever shot. Colours are, what can I say? They have an exuberance, they have a joy, they have an energy. I've used this on my old Sony A7 Mark I. I went down Brick Lane in London to do some shots a while back, and some of these images just blew me away for how nice they are. It's an f1.8 aperture, and I used it wide open all day because it's pretty sharp at f1.8, and that means you get that little bit of blur to separate your subject from your background. And even when you're doing street, I think that can still quite often be an important aesthetic to remember and to hold on to. We don't always want very deep depth of field when we're doing street, though we often do. Quite often also, though, we do want, or I want, a little bit of separation. And this lens does it up to, well, I don't know, 4 or 5 feet, something like that, maybe 6 feet. And of course at closer distances it gives much more blur. So lots of energy in the colours, lots of exuberance, good contrast. The Konica look, which is really a nice look, really a beautiful look. This lens will give it to you. It's nice and fast, so you can use it in lowish light, and it will give you some nice background blur as well. So what's not to like? This is just a fantastic little lens. Prices have gone up. Back in the day, in fact, not that long ago, 5 years ago, you could pick these up for 40 quid all day long. Today they'll be nearer 50, 60 quid or something like that, but it's still an absolute bargain. This is a beautiful optic. I'd grab one now if I were you, because it's very, very nice, and prices can only go one way as the secret catches on, because it's not a secret anymore. Next is another lovely little 50mm f2 that I bought maybe a couple of years ago. This is the Miranda 50mm f2, and this is a surprisingly nice lens. The Nikon 50mm f2 that we just talked about makes beautiful images. This cheap little Miranda lens, made by goodness knows which third-party manufacturer, makes images that are just as nice in its own way. It doesn't have the same colour signature, it doesn't give the same image as the Nikon, but this little optic gives a very beautiful image which in its own way is every bit as nice as that given by the Nikon. Let's have a closer look. And there's our little Miranda lens, and as with many of these f2 lenses, you can see how small it is. It's not too far from a pancake. That's what a small lens this is. There you can see the front element. This one has a certain amount of protection from the sun, though not quite as much as the Nikon. There's the rear element. This is of course a multi-coated lens. It's an 80s lens. It was probably made by Tomioka or Cosina. In fact, it bears a very suspicious resemblance to the Yashica 50mm f2. So I think it might be a Tomioka lens, and going by the image quality, that would certainly be borne out because it does make very lovely images. It's a light lens. There's plenty of, well, I don't know about plenty, some plastic used in its construction. I think all the body, all the outer parts are plastic. Probably well, in fact, certainly there's a metal focusing helix inside, and the mounting ring is metal. This lens may or may not be as long lived as the Nikon, but it's lived a good while and it's still making very nice images. So this lens is a real little beaut. This was a real surprise to me. I was astonished at the quality of the images it can produce. These were made for the Miranda line of cameras, which in the late 70s and early 80s were owned here in the UK by a company, an electronics retailer called Dixon's. They were very cheap, but they were made for people who cared about their photography, who wanted to use a nice SLR and wanted some nice lenses to put on it, but didn't want to pay top dollar. Well, now that comes in handy for you and I, and for all mirrorless photographers, because these are still cheap. I bought this lens for, I think it was about £10. It was very cheap, and I've made some gorgeous images with it, and I was absolutely astonished. It's very sharp. It's got real good sharpness wide open. It renders details really, really clearly and really nicely. It's got fantastic colour. It's, what can I say? It has lots of saturation. It gives colours lots of saturation, but they're not quite so light and bright as the colours from, for example, the Nikon 50mm f2. These are a little darker, a little more strong, a little more substantial than the colours from the Nikon. A slightly different tone, but still very, very beautiful images. It makes lovely background blur. The blur is very soft, surprisingly soft from this lens, and it's not an easy lens to upset. You can't easily find many rough points in the blur from this one. So generally very good performance as far as background blur goes. Colour's lovely, it's very sharp. It's probably got a little bit of chromatic aberration. In fact, I'm sure it has. Most vintage lenses do. And if you shoot wide open at f2, if you're shooting against a very light background like the sky, you will see some slight darkening of the corners. But that's par for the course with these vintage lenses. That's how they give us images filled with character and individuality, as they do. This is a lovely little optic. This one's in K-mount. Many of them, in fact most of them, if not all of them, were made in K-mount. So as for cost, well, I paid £10 for it. You can probably find one for £20 to £30, maybe £40 at the absolute top end, but I'd try to pay no more than £30 if I were you, because that will that's really nearer, I think, what this one is currently worth. But a great little optic, really good find, and a lens that really astonished me and shows that you don't have to pay top dollar or big bucks to get a vintage lens to make a really beautiful image. Finally, a lens that is one of my absolute favourites. You might recognise it from its shiny polished aluminium body. It is the Helios 44 58mm f2, and the Helios 44 and its various derivative developments, the 44-2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7, These are some of my favourite lenses of all time, but the nicest version, I think, the nicest versions are the earliest ones, and those made by KMZ, the 44 and the 44-2. Those are the ones that have this particular shape of body, which I personally think is the nicest shape for a Helios to have. Later versions had a different shaped body, but the 44 and the 44-2 have this shaped body, and I think aesthetics in a lens are important. I think it matters what a lens looks like. There are, broadly speaking, two versions of the Helios 44. There's this, the 13 blade version. There is also an 8 blade version that came in polished aluminium and black bodies. The 13 blade version came only, as far as I know, in this polished version, but all versions are lovely. This one's got 13 blades, so that means bokeh balls are just that little bit more round, and you don't get any straight edged shapes, hexagons or octagons in your aperture, if you've in your background blur rather, if you've stopped your aperture down. But you know, that's kind of a detail really. All these Helios 44s are fantastic. They're sharp in the center, they've got beautiful blur, very, very characterful swirly blur, and they give really nice colors as well. So there's our silvery shiny Helios, and what a beautiful thing it is. This is a direct copy of the CZJ Vivitar lens, and the Vivitar lens was the original swirler. This is a direct copy of it. It doesn't look quite the same in its body, but the optics are identical. In fact, I think certainly the earlier Helios 44 and the 44-2, I think they give a nicer image than the Vivitar. I know there were many versions of the Vivitar, but the version I had compared to this lens, this one was nicer. So that is quite a testament. The front element on this one is fairly deeply dished, giving some protection from sunlight catching the front element. There is the front element with, if we're lucky, we should be able to see the purpley coatings that this one has. You may be able to see them there somewhere. Those are the nicest coatings to have on a Helios lens. They're an M42 mount, apart from the very early ones, which is an M39 mount. This one has an M42 adapter ring on it. It's a nice simple adapter, just a very small metal ring that screws onto the thread and turns it into an M42 lens. You can see, let's have some focus please. Thank you. You can see the two aperture rings there, the pre-selector aperture. This front ring limits the maximum opening of the aperture, or rather the minimum opening of the aperture. It was a system designed for you know, before a camera would automatically stop down a lens, and it works nicely enough. I only ever use the second larger ring at the behind the main one there. That's the one I use. That gives you stepless aperture adjustment, so that's good for video if you're a video shooter. A very, very nice lens, great looking and giving great images also. These lenses are really sharp in the center. In fact, even wide open, they are acceptably sharp, I would say, in the center. The sides and corners are not sharp, they're a little bit soft, but generally in the center, wide open, you will get some nice images from this lens, some good sharpness from this lens. It gets sharper as you stop down, as all lenses do. By f8, it's as razor sharp as any other lens. There's not much in it by f8. They do tend to be broadly similar at f8, although not quite the same. But it does have some really good sharpness, and that's certainly not a problem with this very old design, 1930s design of optic. It gives great colour, it's very exuberant, very joyful, very pumped up. I think the early versions with the purple coatings in the silver body, whether it's 13 blade or 8 blade, silver body, purple coatings give the absolute nicest images. Second after that are the black bodied KMZ built versions, and then the other Helios 44-2 versions follow on from there. But this one gives very, very nice colour, pumped up, saturated, just as I like it. The blur from this lens is really its party piece. You may or may not know that lenses with this Vivitar design give an impression of swirl. If you get specular highlights, that is point light sources in the back of a shot, it gives an energetic, swirly feeling and an impression of motion in the back of a shot, and this lens is a really good way of doing it. There are more expensive ways of doing it and getting more swirl in your shot. The Helios 40 will do that, the TT Artisan 75mm f1.5 will do that, but this will do it too. It won't do it quite as much as some of those other lenses, but it does give a really nice amount of swirl, and you can make a nice portrait with this lens, and you can certainly infuse your images with real visual interest and a real unusual aesthetic. Background blur can be a little harsh from time to time, but that's a question of just adjusting your distances between camera subject and background to take care of that. This is one of the vintage lenses with the most character I can think of. It's very, very famous. It's become an iconic lens. Many filmmakers have used it, including the cinematographer on the recent Dune films. And it's a really great optic, and it can be yours for 40 to 50 pounds. These are still really, really cheap. They were made in the millions, and there are still millions about in good condition. And if they're not in good condition, if there's a little fungus in there or a little dust or a little oil on the blades, this is one of the easiest lenses to take apart and clean up if you're careful and don't go too far. This is a really good lens to, if you want to learn anything about lens servicing, even fairly moderate level of lens servicing, this is a really good one to start with, because it's very, very simple to undo and to get back together. There's no hidden surprises or springs waiting to jump out or little ball bearings that you're going to lose. This is a great way to do it. It's also a great way to get a cheap vintage lens with some that will give some real interesting aesthetic to your shot and make your image stand out. So there we are, 5 really nice f2 vintage lenses that will infuse your images with real character and individuality, and it really infuse your images with a very, very interesting and unusual aesthetic. And that's what vintage lenses are best at, and you don't have to pay lots and lots of money to do it, and you don't have to get the fastest, fanciest vintage lenses to do it. A moderate, relatively humble f2 aperture lens will do it for you, and they're a really good compromise between size, weight, cost, and the final aesthetic that you get from the lens. Just beautiful, all of them. So there we are, that is about it from me for this week. Many, many thanks for watching and tuning in. I really do appreciate that. If you've enjoyed this episode, you might want to chuck us a sub, that would be appreciated. Many, many thanks to subscribers for your support. I really do appreciate that support. And many, many thanks go to patrons for your support. That support is very much appreciated. Heartfelt thanks to anybody who supports the channel in any way. Thanks to anyone who's watched, tuned in, given thanks, super thanks, or engaged with the channel in any other way. Many thanks to you. As for me, that's it for now. But if you're not doing anything too difficult, troublesome, or involving next week is around this time, please do join me for a spot more. Zenography. Cheerio all.